9th January, 1887, northern Great Plains and central Rockies, from Dakota Territory into Wyoming and Montana. November blizzards had already dropped 16 inches of snow in a single storm. Temperatures near 50 below zero locked the ranges. Cattle, light from a droughty summer, began dying by the thousands. Losses would reach 50 to 90% across many herds by March. Most high-country cabins in Wyoming were simple log boxes under several feet of snow, roofs built by eye, rafters paced off, shingle exposure guessed, extra squares ordered just in case. Yet in Forest Service and Park Service surveys of surviving 19th-century log cabins across the northern Rockies, some shingle roofs show straight, even courses and minimal patching, still shedding water a century later. This film reconstructs how one high-country builder used a pin map roof, a marked board with shingle tokens tied to numbered rafters. To end wrong cuts, finish with one extra square, and face 1886 with a sealed roof instead of a guess. In a year when cattle died by the hundreds of thousands, one of the most important survival decisions was made with a pencil, a plank, and a handful of small nails. September 1884 through 1886, composite, Upper Green River and Wind River Basin benches, Wyoming Territory. A frost line runs halfway down unshingled rafters at dawn. Cedar bundles still rest roped on a wagon bed. Grit crunches under hobnails on frozen sheathing as a builder steps onto the frame. The elevation band sits between 7,000 and 7,800 feet. Long freeze seasons, deep snow, and large temperature swings define the climate. Later, climate records and ranch histories anchor typical winter conditions: sustained cold, heavy snow loads, and winds that scour exposed ridges while drifting valleys to eve height. Logistics frame every build. Cedar shingles are milled far from local lodgepole stands. Standard coverage calculations say 100 square feet per square at recommended exposure. The freight chain runs from railhead to wagon freight to pack animal, with seasonal closure when passes drift shut. Typical cabin footprints documented in Park Service and Forest Service surveys measure 16 by 20 or 16 by 22 feet. Logs notched at corners, wall heights near 8 feet, minimal eave overhangs. These are not mansions. They are shelters built within tight budgets of time, labor, and cash. Most small ranchers and trappers treat roofs as finish work, built late in the season with whatever material and time remain. Miscalculation means leaks, emergency patching, or unplanned re-roofing. Range historian accounts note that after the hard winter of 1886 to 1887, home ranch buildings and dependable shelter gained new economic importance. Survival often came down to infrastructure, not luck. Expensive freight plus short seasons plus overstocked ranges equals zero margin for roof failure. A square of shingles might cost $3 at the mill, but hauling it 60 miles adds another $2 and consumes a day of wagon time. Multiply that by 8 or 9 squares instead of 6, and the cost difference funds fencing wire or winter hay. On paper, a 570-square-foot roof should take 6 squares of shingles. In practice, many cabins burned through 8 and still leaked. 1870 through 1885, Northern Rockies and Interior West, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho. Close detail, nail heads rust bleeding through attic boards. Daylight shows at the ridge where thin top courses were stretched to reach. A pail sits under a brown water stain. Preservation and log cabin maintenance manuals describe common 19th century wood shingle practice: split cedar bolts to shingle length, hand dress, and install with 16, 18, or 24-inch shingles at standard exposures. 16-inch shingles at 5-inch exposure provided triple coverage, 3 layers of wood at every point on the roof. Historic roofs showed typical mistakes: irregular rafter spacing, wavering ridgelines, variable exposure from 3.5 inches to 7 inches, stacked vertical joints, and excessive patch layers around chimneys and eaves. Contrast lowland or urban practice with ready resupply and professional crews against isolated builds where 1 or 2 people did everything and often skipped layout tools. Without story poles or framing squares, spacing became pacing, and exposure became eyeballing. Indigenous shelter knowledge offers a different model. Earth Lodge and Hogan traditions deliberately buried structure under homogeneous insulating masses. Roofs were conceived as loads first, surfaces second, a philosophical inversion of frontier shingle practice, where surface-dominated thinking and load was an afterthought. An early 20th century preservation brief notes that historic shingles and their installation patterns combined to create roofs expressive of regional craft practice, good and bad. Field surveys a century later can still read the guesswork in every crooked course and doubled patch. Rule of thumb shingling leads to uneven coverage. Uneven coverage leads to early leaks. Early leaks shorten service life and force expensive repairs during narrow weather windows. In one documented case, a cabin roof showed 3 distinct patch campaigns over 15 years. Each layer represented emergency work, often done in marginal weather, always consuming material that should have gone elsewhere. Field surveys a century later can still read the guesswork in every crooked course and doubled patch. Conceptual frame, with examples from 1880s carpentry practice in the United States. A narrow 1x4 leans against a framing bay, covered in hatch marks and scribbled labels. Sill, window head, door top. Ceiling line. The story pole, also called a story rod, is a 19th century carpentry layout tool. A narrow board marked with critical vertical dimensions, so repeated cuts and placements match without repeated measuring. Carpenter builders use story poles for siding courses, stair risers, and window alignment, turning complex facades into one-dimensional memory sticks. Many homesteaders, freighters, and trappers had prior experience as carpenters or mill hands. They brought mental habits and simple tools, framing squares, story sticks, west even when printed blueprints were rare. The tools were portable. The habits were even more so. The core conceptual leap. Extend the story pole idea into 2 dimensions for a roof. Courses run vertically, rafters horizontally. Use physical tokens, shingle slips on nails, to track progress and consumption. Period carpentry advice stressed setting out shingle or clapboard courses in advance, so seams landed just below openings and corners. 19th century manuals emphasized setting out work once on a rod and working to the rod to eliminate cumulative mistakes. Once you treat a wall or roof as a mapped pattern instead of a blank surface, material usage and joint control become predictable. The shift is from improvisation to system. On a typical house front, a single stick could control every clapboard. Layout rods were standard enough to appear in printed trade literature. The question was whether the same logic could govern every shingle on a roof half buried in snow. If a single marked board could fix every clapboard on a 3-story house, there was no reason it could not also govern every shingle on a 16 by 22 cabin roof half buried in snow. Autumn 1885, reconstructed, high bench above the Upper Green River, Wyoming Territory. A stump serves as a desk. A cheap pencil rests beside a folded tally book. A crate end shows the stamp. Cedar shingles, 16 in, 2500 PCS. Frost already whitens the grass. The case study dimensions match common historic cabins. 16 by 22-foot footprint, 8-foot wall height, 12-inch eave overhang, 8 to 12 roof pitch, 8 inches of rise for every 12 inches of run. Compute the geometry. Half span with overhang gives a slope length near 13 feet. Roof area per side, 13 feet times 22 feet equals roughly 286 square feet. Both sides total roughly 570 square feet. Apply historic shingle guidance. 16-inch shingles at 5-inch exposure provide approximately 100 square feet of coverage per square under triple coverage standards. Paper requirement, 5.7 squares, rounded up to 6 squares for the roof, plus 1 extra square as freight insurance. Breakage, warped pieces, future repairs. Each square is dense, awkward cargo. Wagon freight and pack rates rise sharply with distance and terrain. Every unnecessary square is money and animal time that could have gone to food or fencing. A ranch history notes hay, lumber, and shingle freighting as major contributors to cash outlay after the hard winter. Pre-calculating area and coverage converts vague "order plenty" into a specific stock plan with known margin, 1 extra square, instead of panic ordering or running short at the ridge. On his stump ledger, the numbers came out to 6 squares on the roof and 1 in reserve. Most neighbors never saw that line. They only saw their stacks run short at the ridge. Same site, early build phase, autumn 1885. A 6-foot plank rests on trestles, planed smooth. Pencil marks run every 5 inches up its length. A pouch of small-cut shingle slips sits on the ground beside a coffee tin of nails. Step-by-step reconstruction of the pin map begins with choosing a straight 1x10 from the sheathing pile. Strike a baseline along the bottom edge. Mark parallel lines every 5 inches up the board to represent each shingle course from eave to ridge, roughly 32 lines. Along the length, step off scaled rafter positions. If actual rafters sit 24 inches on center, translate that proportionally into 13 columns across the 6-foot board, accounting for gable rafters at each end. At each grid point, where a course line crosses a rafter mark, drive a small nail. Hang a 3-inch shingle token on each nail. These tokens are cut from scrap shingles, punched at one end. Encode joint staggering by offsetting nail positions in a repeat pattern. Left, center, right. The board now indicates not only which course crosses which rafter, but also where joints should fall relative to each rafter. This is fundamentally a 2-dimensional story pole, a compressed visible representation of the entire roof plan. Layout rods were documented tools for keeping siding courses aligned around windows and doors. This extends the concept. Each token becomes a work unit, a course crossing a specific rafter that must be completed. Removing it locks in coverage and joint position without mental tracking. By the time the first shingle went up, the entire roof already existed in miniature on one board. Same cabin, framing complete, roofing about to start. Chalk marks appear on rafter tails. 1, 2, 3. Knife notches back up the chalk so numbers persist when weather rubs chalk away. A story pole leans against the gable. Number rafters in sequence along the eave, East 1 through West 13, for example, using chalk marks and simple notch codes. On the pin map, label each column with the corresponding rafter number. This ties abstract grid to actual structure. Chalk horizontal lines on the sheathing at the planned 5-inch exposure, starting from a double-thickness starter course at the eave. These lines mirror the board's course spacing. Modern and historic shingle guidance recommends this starter detail to create a straight, drip-shedding edge. Walk through daily workflow. Lay starter and first visible course, nailing high to ensure nail lines remain buried under at least 2 courses above. Triple coverage. As each course passes a numbered rafter, remove the matching token from that course rafter pin on the board. At day's end, compare tokens removed with crate counts. If 10 courses are complete across 13 rafters, that is 130 shingle placements. Check whether shingle consumption matches the plan. A preservation brief notes that historic shingle roofs often followed similar triple coverage principles and benefited from consistent exposure. Fixed exposure plus mapped rafters equals predictable coverage depth. Confidence grows that nail lines remain buried, reducing leak risk. If consumption drifts, Too many shingles per course, or too few, the builder knows immediately and can diagnose the cause. After 10 courses, the board and the crates agreed within a handful of shingles, proof the math held before the first storm. Mid-roof, autumn 1885, as weather begins to turn. A straight edge rocks over a rafter bay. One rafter stands high by nearly half an inch. A hollow opens between two others, daylight visible under the straight edge's center. Identify common defects. Rafters that have twisted as they dried, sheathing boards with pronounced crown or cup, slight deviations from planned on-center spacing. These defects create hollows or high spots where water and ice concentrate, stressing shingles and encouraging leaks. Typical unplanned response: tighten exposure locally and forget to compensate. Final courses near the ridge end up dangerously thin, sometimes 6 or 7 inches of exposure on 16-inch shingles, leaving minimal overlap and single coverage at the most exposed point. With the pin map, local correction becomes deliberate. Slide tokens on a band of courses over the trouble bay to represent denser coverage, 4.5 inches of exposure for 3 courses instead of 5. Slightly stretch exposures above, 5.25 inches, while maintaining triple coverage overall. Adjust total course count if needed and recalculate shingle burn. Later Forest Service research shows snow load sensitivity to depressions and irregularities. Good even coverage reduces point loads and ice dams. Snow load guidance emphasizes uniform surfaces, distributing loads more safely. By writing corrections onto the board, the builder prevents local fixes from knocking the entire roof off its shingle budget and exposure plan. Each adjustment is visible. The cumulative effect is known before reaching the ridge. The board showed exactly where he had spent extra inches and where he would quietly earn them back. 20th and 21st century surveys of 19th century cabins in the northern Rockies, Forest Service, Park Service, State Preservation Offices. A preservation architect's photograph captures a log cabin's gable. Elevation. Shingle courses march dead straight from eave to ridge. Minimal patching shows after decades of service. Log cabin and historic building surveys identify clear patterns. Some cabins show highly regular shingle courses, consistent exposure, and very little over-roof patching after decades. Others display wavering lines, stacked joints, and multiple re-roofing campaigns. Examine rafters and sheathing where visible. Consistent on-center spacing versus ad hoc framing tells its own story. Documentary hints appear in inventories listing unused shingles stored in lofts and photographs showing neatly stacked spare bundles above finished ceilings. Connect these field observations back to what a pin-mapped roof would leave behind: even exposure and joint staggering that match modern best practice, lower incidence of stain tracking along nail lines, cleaner attic spaces without evidence of chronic dripping. A preservation brief urges careful study of historic installation patterns because they embody regional craft solutions, not random improvisation. Where records are thin, the roofs themselves become the archive. Systematic planning in the build phase translates into cleaner, longer-lived roofs observed decades later. Some roofs still function a century after installation, their original shingles weathered but sound. Others failed within 2 decades, requiring complete replacement and leaving stain evidence throughout the structure. Where records are thin, the roofs themselves become the archive. And some clearly read like they were built from a ledger. Winter of 1886 to 1887 focus on Wyoming and Montana ranges. Modern snow load research sites in the Rockies. A measured snow stake emerges from a drift, 3 to 4 feet of settled depth. A core sample hangs on a scale to estimate water content and weight. The big die-up unfolded across multiple blizzards, prolonged cold and snow depths that left cattle stranded and many structures drifted in. Losses reached 50 to 90% across many herds. Range operations that survived often consolidated around home ranches with better housing. Introduce basic snow load mathematics using modern Forest Service work. Pounds per square foot estimated from depth and density. Translate 3 to 4 feet of settled snow, accounting for melt-freeze cycles and crusting, into approximate roof loads for the case study cabin. Wet, settled snow can weigh 15 to 30 pounds per cubic foot. A 4-foot layer translates to 60 to 120 pounds per square foot. Apply that to a 16 by 22 roof, roughly 570 square feet, under 100 pounds per square foot, equals 57,000 pounds total. Nearly 30 tons pressing on rafters, sheathing, and shingles. Describe how poorly built roofs fail. Concentrated drifts at valleys and against windward eaves. Water penetration at ridges where final courses were stretched. Thin, long-term creep and sagging where framing or sheathing was underdimensioned or weakened by chronic leaks. Contrast with a well-laid shingle field of uniform thickness and coverage distributing loads more evenly and keeping meltwater on top of wood, not along nail paths. Historical commentary notes that after the hard winter, many ranch operations consolidated around home ranches with better housing and shelter, implying survival advantage for better-built structures. The winter provides an unplanned full-scale test. Consistent coverage and secure nailing either keep roofs intact or expose every weak decision. Under 3 feet of crusted snow, the arithmetic on that pin map board was no longer theoretical. 1880s through 1890s, frontier homesteads and ranch headquarters across Wyoming and Montana. Store ledger pages show a line for shingles, 1 square, another for nails, 8 penny, and a terse note. Roof repair after storm. Quantify material differences. Pin-mapped roof, roughly 6 squares used efficiently for approximately 570 square feet of coverage, with 1 extra square left over. Guess-laid roof, 8 to 9 squares consumed over time, counting miscuts, emergency patching, and partial re-roofs. Translate this into freight and labor. Each additional square represents an extra animal load and at least a day of travel to and from a mill or depot. Repairs during the brief thaw season compete with planting, haying, and fence maintenance. Time spent on ladders is time not spent on income-producing work. Historic preservation and maintenance manuals show how chronic leaks accelerate decay in log plates, rafters, and interior finishes, forcing earlier major repairs or replacement. Water tracks along nail lines, stains attic boards, rots top courses, and undermines structural integrity. A cabin that should last 30 years needs major work at 15. Frame this as survival arithmetic. A marginal homestead that has to re-roof after a hard winter may miss key work windows, slip into debt for materials, or abandon the claim. Range historical sources note that many poorly capitalized operations vanished after 1886 to 1887, while those with better infrastructure and hay survived. Every wrong cut cascades through freight, time, and exposure to the next winter. Pin mapping does not just save shingles. It protects time and cash when both are scarce. Over 10 years, 3 extra squares and 2 lost weeks on ladders could be the difference between keeping the place and walking away. Bridge between 1880s practice and early 20th century standardization. A printed carpenter's manual from the 1890s lies open to a table listing recommended shingle exposures and side laps. Columns show shingle length, roof pitch, and corresponding exposure limits. By the late 19th century, trade literature increasingly codified what experienced builders already knew: minimum exposures, triple coverage, proper side lap to avoid stacked joints. Manuals specified that 16-inch shingles should be laid at 5-inch exposure on roofs steeper than 4 to 12 pitch to maintain proper weather protection. Connect the pin map to this broader trend. It is a frontier carpenter's way of enforcing these rules visually and physically, in an environment where one person often does all tasks without written plans. The board becomes the plan. The tokens become the checklist. Contrast custom. We have always just eyed it. With method. Visible grids, calculated areas, pre-planned stock. Parallels exist in other frontier systems. Ditch gradients measured with water levels, wagon weights checked against axle capacity, hay tonnage estimated from stack dimensions. Rule of thumb gives way to measured practice as stakes rise. Carpentry columns and story pole discussions emphasize reducing errors and misread measurements by relying on layout sticks rather than memory. Once this mindset reaches the roof, leaks and waste stop being bad luck and become identifiable planning failures. The real innovation was not cedar, nor nails, nor rafters. Those materials were common everywhere. The innovation was the decision that a roof was a system, not a guess, a field of intersections that could be mapped, counted, and controlled. The real innovation was not cedar, nor nails, nor rafters. It was the decision that a roof was a system, not a guess. 1900 to present. Rocky Mountain Region Building Guidelines and Historic Site Standards. A modern design snow load map shows ground data and code tables listing required roof pitches and shingle exposures for different zones. Numbers that once lived on a stump ledger now appear in printed standards. Show continuity between pin map logic and modern practice. Building codes specify design snow loads using ground data and conversion factors. Preservation briefs require matching historic shingle exposure and patterning to maintain performance and character. Modern cedar shingle installation instructions still recommend exposures and side laps that echo the triple coverage logic used in historic practice. Technical bulletins warn against variable exposure and stacked joints because they shorten roof life and increase leak risk. What the anonymous high country builder did with a plank and tokens, mapping loads and coverage, now lives in tables, diagrams, and inspection checklists. Forest Service and state guidance documents warn that improper exposure and joint alignment drastically reduce shingle service life. Emphasize that what began as a personal survival method aligns with later institutional knowledge. The frontier solution holds up under modern engineering scrutiny. Agencies codify lessons learned from roofs that failed and roofs that stood. Government engineers in Forest Service and Park Service specify shingle length and exposure, minimum eave, overhang, framing spacing, and sheathing thickness. Standard Ranger cabin plans prescribe roof assemblies down to nail size and placement. Pattern thinking moves from individual stumps and boards into printed sheets, stamped and numbered. Today, anyone with a codebook and a tape has the luxury of formal tables. On that bench, the entire code was scratched into one board. Composite present-day inspection of a 19th century high country cabin. Reference back to 1886 to 1887. A loft photograph shows dust on old cedar bundles. Wrapper remnants still cling to the wire binding. Below, course lines run straight and even across an intact shingle field. Revisit the case study numbers. Roughly 570 square feet of roof, 6 squares used, 1 square left untouched. This detail matches inventories that occasionally list surplus roofing stored in lofts, unopened and undisturbed for decades. Briefly restate the chain of decisions. Calculated area and exposure, built the pin map grid, numbered rafters, and followed a fixed pattern. Adjusted locally without losing global control. The result? Fewer wasted shingles, fewer leaks, fewer repair days, longer service life under heavy snow winters. Connect to human outcomes. In a period when many cattle outfits collapsed after the hard winter while better organized operations survived, robust shelter and controlled waste were part of staying in business. Shelter failure forced re-roofing at the worst possible time, consuming cash and labor when both were needed elsewhere. A preserved cabin report notes that original shingles remained in service far beyond typical replacement cycles, with minimal evidence of failure. Some roofs documented in Forest Service and state surveys show original material still performing after 80 or 90 years. Final documentary image. Course lines running true. No sag, no patches. One full square still stacked where it was hoisted before the snows came. In a landscape where winter often decided which names stayed on the tax rolls and which vanished from the maps, the difference, in this case, was a roof planned like a ledger, every course counted, every rafter mapped, and one full square still stacked in the loft when the snow came. If you value fact-grounded frontier history and the small technical decisions that kept cabins standing under winters like 1886 to 1887, consider supporting the channel so we can keep digging into these field manual stories and the documents behind them.